And so this morning we've heard some very exciting things about where the technology is going. And just a very brief word about what it is that we do at the Center for Neurotechnology Studies. We were derived from the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment back in 1994, so our goal is to take a look at emerging areas of science and technology and then assess those, both with regard to their technological capabilities and, of course, the ethical, legal, and social import, and all the issues that arise from them. Neurotechnologies. Back in the middle of the last decade, we were tasked with doing something called a neurotechnology future study. And in that study, it was shown that both alone and convergently with a variety of other biosciences, neurotechnologies probably pose one of the largest elements of affecting different aspects of society, obviously healthcare, public life, as we've already heard, and increasingly national security, intelligence, and defense. So one of the things I want to do right off the bat is recognize that most of my work, the majority of it, has been funded by a number of different agencies, both internationally and within the United States, that do national security, intelligence, and defense work, as well as many others. But what I want to make sure is that you understand that the positions that I'm advocating here are solely those of the Center for Neurotech Studies and do not represent, and I do not represent in any way the United States government, Department of Defense, or NATO. That said, let's take a look at what neuroscience has actually done. As we've heard here over the course of the lectures, we've seen that neuroscience has made tremendous leaps over the past 20 to 30 years. In fact, the field of neuroscience, titularly, was only around since the early 1970s. I'll date myself just a little bit. When I got into the field, it wasn't even called neuroscience. There were only 3 programs in the United States at that time that had dedicated neuroscience programs. Now, you can't swing a wet rope over your head without hitting neuroscience programs in high schools, colleges, universities, freestanding institutes. So we've seen neuroscience as a social trend, and we've really moved from a number of different ways that have allowed us some very rudimentary aspects to understand the neural structure, neural function, being a little more sophisticated in our approach to this. And neuroscience, by its nature, has done this through the interaction of tools and theory. You saw that earlier this morning. You saw that in Simon's talk. He was discussing how this area of neurotechnology has been instrumental to allow neuroscience to make particular gains. And then neuroscience has then allowed the development of particular technologies that are then assessment technologies and access and manipulative technologies. Formerly, we referred to these as tools to theory and theory to tools heuristics. The idea that we're utilizing various tools that were widely available in the biological sciences to gain insight into the structure and function of nervous systems and ultimately the brain. And then as we've developed a larger theoretical corpus, that level of epistemological capital has then offered us new opportunities, vectors, if you will, to develop certain technologies to then access those aspects of neuronal structure and function that we find to be not only accessible, but then ultimately those things that we can assess, as you well know, become targets of manipulation. So the tools have been both tools for neuroscience, and also the theory has been the basis for neurotechnology. So we see a reciprocal interaction. And the reason I tell you this is that you should expect no different. As we begin to see more sophistication with the neurotechnological tools, both implantable tools that we've heard here, as well as other assessment tools, what you'll begin to see is that the actual science itself will move. You have a larger epistemological capital, and we're going to cash in on that capital. So what we find is that these tools to date have allowed us, as you've seen this morning, go through some videos and presentations, the ability to access, assess, and manipulate neural function. And that has been used to date primarily to evaluate, treat, and in some cases prevent pathology. One could make the argument that the very strong driver has always been the beneficent push of utilizing the science and technology towards in some way affecting the human predicament and enhancing the human condition. And I'm using the word enhance only with regard to the nature of flourishing, sustainability of the human condition against things like disease, environmental insult, etc. Certainly. As well, as you saw earlier in our last presentation, we can also alter sensation and, of course, cognition, emotion, and behavior. It's this, coupled with this, that has certainly been a major impetus for the type of technologies we're dealing with here, implant technologies. Well, the idea of neuroscience and neurotechnology as reciprocal tools to theory and theory to tools heuristic has been instrumental in developing these technologies. I won't bore you with giving you more of the science. There are plenty of people in the room who provide more than ample chapter and verse on what the science is, and we're all here gathered to talk about this. So we understand that this is not some type of futuristic technology. It is current technology. It is rapidly developing technology. It is technology that has a host of applications that range from affecting the pathological to increasingly being used as biosensors and being able to manipulate a the structures and function of the brain. And what becomes important is the nature of this, the frontier area of this neurotechnology. Remember the idea of tools to theory and theory to tools reciprocal heuristics. We've gone from looking at the brain as being site-specific, the old idea of Brodmann mapping, to say this area of the brain does, that area of the brain does, to a far less mereological orientation that now recognizes that the way brains work is networked activity in a variety of structures that are both spatially and temporally dependent. We also understand that much of these dependencies may be individualized, may be plastic, and change as an interaction both phenotype and environment. So we've gone from this understanding to this understanding. So if in fact we're going to come along and we're going to put something in that exists here, it's not just a question that we're affecting a particular locus here or here or here, but rather what we're really doing is we're affecting a variety of coursing loci that are not just structurally related, but functionally related. The idea of the brain as systems within systems, work as multi-dimensional networks within a hierarchical working space, has become de rigueur in neuroscience. So the idea of implantable technologies are not simply because they're site-specific, but because they offer the potential to alter the network activity of a brain, inclusive of the ability to first assess that brain, define that brain on an individual level, and then be able to access those brain networks so as to manipulate and control particular aspects of that brain's structural functions. So obviously, what we've done is we've had a pendulum swing. And as you've heard from some of the talks this morning, it's been a fairly rapid pendulum swing. Now certainly there are a lot of things we can't do, but there are also a lot of things we can do. And it's the interaction between what we can do and what we yet don't know that create these frontier aspects of implantable neurotechnological progress. The thing that we confront over and over and over again, as I've heard many of the conversations I've had with you offline, is that any and all aspects of neuroscience, number one, and certainly the technologies, number two, will sooner or later come face to face with Chalmers' proverbial hard questions of neuroscience. Simply put, we've done wonderful things through technology to allow us very, very good knowledge of the brain at a number of levels. For those of you who have a more philosophical bent, you have a pretty good idea of the formal causality of the brain. We understand the way there's a formal operations in biological systems, and ever more, we're getting a pretty good idea of that as dynamic, complex systems that are nested. Moreover, we have a pretty good material causal understanding of the way the brain works, and I showed you some of that just before. We understand the way neurons work. We understand the way neurons in glia work. We understand the way certain sites in the brain work. What we lack is an efficient causal explanation of brain. In other words, we don't really know how the gray stuff makes the great stuff of consciousness. And as a result, anything that we do that has a mechanistic understanding remains, number one, contingent and number two, speculative. But that's important. In other words, the foundation upon which we're standing represents a continually shifting architectonic of knowledge. So at very, very best, what we see is that any or all of these technologies that we use are based upon a contingent understanding that represents the naturalism that we have at hand, what Almeida refers to as harmless naturalism. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. I'm not slamming that. That's simply what we do. We do this all the time. We used to think the world was flat. We used to think that everything revolved around the earth. All of these things were perfectly operative. Moreover, the more techniques and technologies we have, the better we're able to revise that. That's the spirit of science. Science remains self-contingent, self-reflective, and self-revisionist, right? So any one of these particular implants have these problems that go along with it. And I would argue that these do, in fact, represent the basis for ongoing and future research, certainly the interactive effects of the implants. We don't necessarily know what those brain regions do specifically. Moreover, they vary in individuals, and as a result, the technology remains tentative. Put it in and let's see. We talked earlier about an experiment with an N of 1. My argument would be they're all an N of 1. The reason being we're dealing with a plastic individualized system. Number two, long-term effects. We may not necessarily know based on two things. Number one, the technology itself remains incipient and nascent. We've only been doing this for a while, so we don't have a large enough database. And number two, we simply haven't left these things in there long enough to have these empirical data to tell us what may occur. Certainly, there's also the risk of runaway effects. That's to say that you're dealing with a neuronal network system, so you put the thing in, And what if you begin to then get effects you didn't anticipate, which then opens the door for what are sometimes referred to as Wechselblatt effects, which is a nice way of saying that nature sometimes has a nasty sense of humor. We thought it was going to do this, and then all of a sudden we get what is colloquially referred to in military terms as the oops phenomenon. Oops. This happens all the time. Once again, this is not reason for any way to stop the research. In fact, I would argue this is impetus to do even more research. But what this really tells us is that this intersection of both knowns and unknowns, and the proverbial capacity and urge, the demiurge, if you will, of neurotechnology to affect and control, allows us to continue to push that frontier, go ever more to the boundary. And each time we get to that boundary, the horizon of possibility goes just a little bit higher. This is very seductive, incredibly seductive, for a number of reasons. So obviously what we're seeing is that these neurotechnologies, and one could argue almost any of these neurotechnologies, but certainly these implantable neurotechnologies, because of their sophistication, their sexiness, they're in the brain. They're actually interfacing with the substrate of that parenchyma that allows us that level of manipulation, access, and control. And moreover, when coupled to other technologies such as nanotechnology, increasingly being shrunk down. We heard that this morning. We understand the power of this to assess and affect human performance. You saw that graphically on the video of the gentleman who had Parkinson's after deep brain stimulation. He's up doing a jig. You saw some of the other things that are going. Remember, this is nascent technology, some of the work that Professor Warwick is doing. He said, well, yeah, isn't it just like I'm buzzing you on? But let's not forget that a mere 10 years ago, this was the size of a cell phone. Remember those? Hi, I'm feeling very sophisticated, I'm calling home. Now, a computer? I don't know about you, but I used to have a computer on my desk that was about that wide, about that big, and I thought that was slicker than snot. Now, so we see that the pendulum swing of technology is such that what used to be 20-year evolutions has now been compressed down to about 5. This represents no different. So what we're seeing is a number of these limiting factors are being delimited by a number of convergences. Technological and engineering convergences and convergences within the sciences themselves. As cutting-edge technology, nothing is sexier to national security than cutting-edge technology. And I would argue that this is born by historicity. This isn't brand new. One need only to take a look at the work of the ancients, come on up through the Middle Ages. Look at the portfolio of Leonardo. Everyone loves Leonardo. He's a wonderful, wonderful artist. Come on, the guy was pimping his stuff primarily at every different duchy so as to be able to devise a variety of equipments and technologies for defense. Show me an example where national defense was not predicated on some cutting-edge aspect of science and technology. If it isn't, that country has lost. The country that says, no, 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 we're not going to embrace fill in the blank. Black powder, weapons, armor. We're going to continue to use cavalry. So we can see the attraction of science and tech. The attraction of science and tech is grounded to a philosophical orientation of the body politic to protect the polis. And if in fact the guy next door, girl next door is developing something that has a sniff of something you don't have, at the very, very least you want to be aware of it. History has taught us that if you're not, that can be problematic. Neurotechnology, no different. It represents a technological trend that we see in much of national security, intelligence, and defense, and not only in those countries in the West, but in any more countries that can then gain such technology to leverage it in 3 primary areas. Number 1, economic. He who holds the chips characteristically runs the game. Number 2, public, because it then publicly influences. And number 3, obviously, in the world of intelligence and warfare. So we see the attraction of these technologies in this venue. But obviously, this then raises a number of what I would call frank neuroethical concerns. I mean, in the strict definition of where we locate neuroethics on the philosophical, ethical, legal, and social map. The first neuroethical concern is, as I just mentioned, this is nascent, incipient science and technology, with all the portfolio of issues, problems, questions, and dilemmas that go along with that. Number 2 is that we then have to confront the limits of what this stuff really does. And we've heard a bit of this morning. It's doing X, Y, and Z. It's like, are you sure? It's like, my cousin Vinny, how can you be so sure? Well, we think we know it works like this. But if tomorrow we find out that that works something different, then we revise the paradigm. Again, there's no harm in that. But there is an incipience that goes along with this that reflects contingency. Moreover, one of the issues is that right now we do have to confront the technical limitations of the neurotechnology. This is very sophisticated stuff. However, we're also putting it in something that's pretty sophisticated, and the interaction of those sophistications creates a complexification that imparts particular limitations. We are vulnerable to two things here. Number one is what philosopher Hans Lenk referred to as the technological imperative, which I refer to as the philosophical field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you can build it, we will. If we will build it, we'll use it. And number two is something that I refer to as the mechanistic paradox. We loathe things that have a mechanism. If we have to throw our hands up in the air and say we don't know how it works, we move away from that. Oh, this is flights of fancy. This is piffle. We're not going to deal with this. So what do? Very often we'll create a partial explanation, and it's good enough. It's fine. Yeah, that's great. We'll go with that explanation, only to recognize that the explanation that we used 5, 10, 15 years down the line wasn't quite right, but it was good enough at the time. Because we need that explanatory medium so as to be able to provide the nexus for us to move ahead. We cannot accept that something is working unless we know how it works, even if that explanation might be wrong. And there are plenty of examples where this has happened. Moreover, the issue is that there is a very, very strong urge, a strong pull to utilize those forms of science and technology that are new, that are nascent, because of their novelty. The possibility to revise and upgrade the existing portfolio is tremendous. So as we go ahead with this, we then confront these deeper neuroethical issues that become particularly salient when we're dealing with not only neurotechnology in the public sphere, but increasingly neurotechnology as might be used for a large agenda of national security, intelligence, and defense. And what I mean by this is security of the individual who fall under the rubric of national protection, the ability of a government to say, should we use this or should we not? How do we regulate? Also the fact that others might in fact be developing these technologies, and how might these then be leveraged in some way that could affect what we do? How do we find out about them, and how do we defend against inapt use or frank misuse? And there's a number of things that come up over and over again. We've sniffed some of these this morning, and I've seen them in the questions where an eyebrow will go up. The first is that technical rectitude does not necessarily equal moral soundness. I can use something the right way, but it doesn't necessarily mean the good way. I can tell you the best way to use a gun, for example, is to take two hands, line it up, make sure the barrel is pointed that way, and pull the trigger. That doesn't necessarily mean if I do that to Christian, it's a good thing. It just means that I've used that technology appropriately. I didn't put it in my ear and go, look what this does. I went like that. So using the technology in ways for which it was designed to be used, does that necessarily not mean that it is necessarily good? Now we get onto that very iffy issue of, I've opened Pandora's box. What is the good? For whom? Why? We'll get to that in a moment. The second thing is that these technologies can be inaptly used. Put them in the wrong hands. If in fact we don't have a full repertoire of technical understanding, you then get lack of aptitude. These things are not being properly used. I've actually seen that in wide array with regard to some of the assessment technologies, and you know all about this. I think no-lie MRI, the idea of the utilizing functional MRI to be able to discern whether or not someone is lying or not. Now, there's great appeal for that because it turns us to technology as a form of certainty. The idea of certainty nested in our technological skills to be able to bridge that gap of objectivity and subjectivity. This is very, very attractive. But that reflects the earlier issue of the limit of what this technology can really do. Then you have frank misuse. Not just this thing is being inaptly used, but it is being used for the wrong purposes altogether. And there are those who would argue that the use of some of these neurotechnologies to do certain things represents frank misuse. The idea here, for example, putting in brain implants in individuals just to give them like ongoing pleasure all the time, irrespective of their job or any social constraints. That might be a tongue-in-cheek example of frank misuse. But what I've heard from each and all of you around the room as we're dealing with this is that much of this skirts on that tenuous interface between what might be treatment and what might be enhancement. Now, what we actually do is we navigate between the cylinder of treatment and the charybdis of enhancement when we deal with national security and military issues, because we then create a new opportunity for use, which is called enablement. I talked that very briefly this morning. Enablement exists when there's already an ethical, socially, legally sanctioned silo in which we say that some aspect of this particular area of performance incurs an ethical load whereby maximizing or optimizing the performance of that individual is justificatory for the use of these types of interventions. So for example, there are those who would say perhaps the military, if in fact these things can keep the military out of harm's way or even mitigate the urge to fight. Might these things actually suppress the capacity for individuals to become aggressive and wage war? The idea of an individual becoming perhaps more cognitively capable, leftward shifting the wisdom acquisition curve, making them more cognitively, motorically apt. Who then might get these? Well, the combat warfighter, certainly, the pilot, perhaps, the surgeon. One might argue perhaps the individual who's doing high-tech engineering work. I've even heard it argued that perhaps teachers, clergy, lawyers, although that's debatable. So we then have to recognize what is a viable silo for enablement. How much intervention? Just out in the hall, we're talking about, well, what you want to do is you want to bring people up to a norm. Really? Whose norm? And how often does that happen? Yeah, it's good. A little bit more. I'm awake in the morning, but I'm really awake after that cup of coffee. Lord knows, I might be really, really awake after I get a little jolt somewhere in my ventral posterior medial thalamus. Well, who gets these things? I don't know what your healthcare system is like, but I can tell you what our healthcare system is like. And although there may be chapter and verse under the Healthcare Act that suggests that the use of new biotechnologies certainly falls within the rubric of what could be used, in reality, you know as well as I do that these things very often it's the individual who can afford them, who either has very, very good insurance or is paying out of pocket. Now what we're doing is we're seeing a schism between the haves and the have-nots. When this refers to the military, or for national security, intelligence, and defense, who are we going to enable? And what happens when they're not in a silo anymore? Do you then dis-enable them? Or do you let them go, and does that then become something which is known as post-enablement distress syndrome, what we call PEDS, which, before you laugh, represents a real entertainable entity on our side of the pond. What are we going to do if we actually enable these people? Because then you say, what are you enabling them for? And if they're not doing that anymore, where do you put them? Do you keep them in that job forever? Well, that might not work. Hi, I'm 75 years old and I'm a special forces operator. You can't even walk. You have no teeth. What are you doing? Do we put them back in the community, and then what job do they do? And if, in fact, we say, well, they really can't do a job, whose responsibility is to care for them? The military? The VA? The police? And if, in fact, we're just looking at that very, very narrow silo of the military, and I'm not denying for a fact that there might be some real use here, how then do you determine who gets what, how, for what purposes, and what you do with them? And then, of course, as so often, both on a synaptic level and on a social level, you have to look at existential gain and existential loss. You know, brains work on a very, very interesting principle. And I'm going to get cheeky for just a moment. You pump up the volume here, you sort of pump down the volume here. It doesn't really work like you're playing all 88 keys on the piano at any one given time. If I'm playing a lot of bass, I want to play a lot of treble. Very often do these things not happen at the same time. So whether I go from the synaptic to the social, I have to weigh out existential gain and existential loss. If I'm augmenting these brain networks, what am I doing to those brain networks? Moreover, if in fact I'm increasing these behaviors, cognitions, emotions, and motoric outflows, what am I losing in the process? And if in fact that loss may indeed be justifiable under circumstance A, in whom for what? What happens when circumstance A transitions into circumstances B through Z? What do we do then? That's when we really encounter what we sometimes refer to as NELSI, neuroethical, legal, and social issues. Now, this is not just straight sort of philosophical neuroethics. This is where it really hits the road. This is where it really gets some traction. Because this is where we let the cat out into the social milieu. And we hinted at this before. If technical rectitude is not the same as moral soundness, and moral soundness that implies an ethical goodness, who's good? What good? If one of the things that we're saying is, well, these technologies have great potential, perhaps, to alter those networks that engage in cognition, and we want to avoid things like deception, we want to avoid things like violent behavior, agreed, that's fine.
If what we're saying is we can use some of these to treat, for example, psychopathy, a definable disorder, psychopathy, it gets a little more cheeky when we begin to talk about things like socially deviant behavior. Well, really, in what society? What level of deviance? To what norm? What you may call social deviance, I may call frank nationalism. I just don't happen to be in your country, so is this a when in Rome, do as the Romans do? As you cross our border, you're going to get this implant. Now, again, a little tongue-in-cheek, but the idea is who's good? How do we define those norms and standards? What guidelines need to be in place to determine how these things should be used versus how they can be used? Moreover, there's the whole issue of privacy and protection. This is an interesting issue. Individuals really want protection. They really want to feel over and over again that the neuroscientific and neurotechnological community is doing something. In fact, after the last shootings we had in the United States, back in Phoenix, and after the shootings that occurred in Oslo, literally our institute was being bombarded by public calls, people pointing the finger and going, why aren't you doing something? What do you want us to do? Do you want us to monitor everyone's brain? Do you want us to monitor everyone's genome? Do you want us to put implants that are biosensors? Well, no, you can't do that, then you're going to invade privacy. It's a cake and eat it too. So the idea of libertarian privacy versus public protection is an interesting admixture that needs to be balanced, and perhaps can. Then you have the whole issue of the Foucauldian biopower idea. The haves versus the have-nots. Those who are implanted versus those who are not. What do we deal with that? We're dealing with biological capability over those who then may be more vulnerable. We may be creating marginalities. And then, of course, you do have this obligation of politics to protect the polis, what that might mean. Does that mean advancing this? Does that mean defining this? Well, in some cases, yes. Does that mean utilizing this in a military situation so as to make sure that we ascertain that no one else is going to do this? We talked about the impending threat. Each and all of these become very, very important when you deal with this visage of national security. And that's an important thing to deal with. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, as you probably have already guessed, this is a two-faced coin. This is a Unusian visage to the core. And in fact, in many ways, it reflects the way people look at the scientist. White coat, savior of society, or somebody with a hunch on their back who's like creating like artificial brains in the laboratory. Yelling, it's alive! Look, we see this all the time. And in fact, if you don't believe me, the best metric of this is what we use. Look at these. These are all things that relate to brain implants. This is supposed to be the idea of the external brain, the idea of sort of panpsychism that is allowable by person-to-person communication through the use of implants. The idea of using neurons and chips and creating a human being that is able to go on via the silicon self. The ability to access the phenomenological subjective. The ability to engage control at a level that may in fact eradicate those problems of the human predicament. Look at how beautiful that image is. Then you got this. The implant addict, where suddenly those things go wrong because of a failure to recognize the time limitations that may occur on a floor, that may occur with regard to the network properties of the brain, that may occur as a consequence of phenotypic, genotypic, and environmental interactions. And of course, when we talk about national security, what people think is you're going to have the automaton army, implanted, ready to go, and absolutely diffused against any form of social intervention, because this then represents the neural robot that's being controlled by someone somewhere else. Well, these represent those Unusian visions. On one side, yes, there is a utopian vision, as you in fact just mentioned this morning. These things hold great potential to decrease the human predicament, enhance and augment human flourishing and the human condition. And it is arguable that the strong driver, even in a national security and defense agenda, is towards advancing such beneficence, that we should protect those that are ours against those things that might impugn what we may have and hold dear. And in fact, this then speaks to the whole issue of neurosecurity. In an ideal world, these things should never, ever, ever be used in ways that might incur some potential harm. Please let us not be naive. We're all adults. Let's not fall victim to the is versus ought dichotomy. In reality, although we shouldn't employ any science and technology in ways that could incur harms, you know as well as I do that very often they do. And moreover, there's a real reason for this. The longer something is out there, so to speak, the more it will in fact have the possibility to incur potential harms, because it's a broader population that is using it. The idea of longitudinal effects become more apparent. The more wide the distribution is of use, and the longer it's out on the market, the more it can be misused, abused, and or the more it can fatigue. And as a consequence, that's what we see. Neuroscience and technology, like any other science and technology, possesses the same risks. And this really does bespeak at least some need for neurosecurity. Now, one of the areas of neurosecurity that's very important is something we alluded to earlier this morning. The fact that although we would like to think that those countries that have nothing but beneficent interest in mind are the only ones that are working on this, that may not be true. And moreover, what we define as our beneficent interest may not necessarily be the same as others. So what we tend to find here is that there are other groups, nation groups and agent groups, that are actually working on this stuff. And moreover, as many of you know, a lot of this technology is not the same as a nuke. You can build this stuff in your garage. And as a consequence, it doesn't necessarily take that same level of concentrated effort to be able to build these technologies. There is a very small niche of neurotechnology in which I work, which is called neuroweaponology. And I'm lucky, I sleep at night, because some of that is really scary. This is somebody in their basement decides they can do this because you can get monoclonal DNA, and you can get reagents, and you can get neurotoxins right off the shelf. Moreover, even if we're not taking such dystopian scenarios with these implantable technologies, understand there are real dedicated efforts by a number of different countries on the world stage so as to become more economically valuable players on the world stage. The person that owns the chips calls the game. And increasingly we're seeing an outsourcing of this technology to other nations that are becoming ever more viable, capable, and credible on the world stage. And as we discussed this morning, their socio-ethical and philosophical systems may not, in fact, be aligned with those of the West, which does not necessarily make them wrong or bad, but it certainly does provide them with a lot more economic clout at the world stage bargaining table, number one. Number two, affect the viability of public health, which is certainly a security and defense issue. And number three, may prompt a revision in our philosophical and ethical orientation to what we consider to be technical rectitude and moral soundness. In advancing various products to market, how they got there based upon being able to appreciate other ethical systems and not exerting a form of Western ethical egoism or imperialism. And so we have to consider these things. And so obviously one of the things we have here is that a lack of commitment to this type of neurosecurity does not preclude the fact that others might in fact actually be maybe engaging in these research, development, and testing procedures. In fact, it may actually bump it up. If I see that she's not doing a blessed thing, good! That means that I can gain a foothold on this. So my argument here is simple. Understand that these types of technologies that we're talking about this morning, and certainly others that are related and or that are fractally sort of developed from them, there is a real need for this. It must remain capable. The idea is that we have to continue to do research to figure out what is going on, what can be done, and from the what can be done posture very strongly, what should be done, there is a strong necessity for. It has to remain competent, not only scientifically and technically, but ethically. And when I mean ethically, I mean also an understanding of the fact that we may have to revise particular ethical systems so as to be able to better appreciate not only the way these things can be used, but the way these things might be developed and might be used, and what that means on the global stage. And we have to remain committed to this as well. It's not simply enough to say, oh no, we're not going to go there. So the question really here is, how do we shave with Occam's razor while riding in on Neurot's boat? And for those of you who aren't philosophers, I'll tell you what this means. How do we cut through the chase and not disassemble the entire paradigm from the beginning? But Neurot's boat is simple. I'm out at sea. I spring a leak. How am I going to fix this? I can't disassemble the boat. What I have to do is I have to use the tools at hand. And how can I do this in a way that is simple? How can I navigate a way forward so as to be able to recognize the potential and possibility of these implantable technologies? This is something we can do. We can't sort of plug our ears and go rah, 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 and say we're not going to look, we're not going to consider the fact that there are many nations that are engaged in this research, that it may in fact be a great opportunity for a globalization of the use of neurotechnology on the world stage of healthcare, but also understand that there are a number of different factors that predicate it. Many of these factors are economic. Some are much more malignant than economic. Some really have to do with world control, power, manipulating the world stage, and some are frankly combative. And as a consequence, a simple precautionary principle, in my argument, will not work for a number of reasons, not least of which is that it's anachronistic. 50 years ago, perhaps, because a precautionary principle, given the fact that technology was relegated to a group of nations over which you could surveil pretty easily, would say that if we stopped and there was some alignment of treaty and agreement, there was a relative cessation or at least slowing of where that technology would go. However, I think the nuclear age has taught us that that is not the case. The Star Wars defense issue has taught us that that is not the case. The debacle about chemical warfare after the First World War has taught us that that is not the case. And so the idea of alignment, even within a set of Western countries, becomes very, very difficult if we now have frank globalization with many, many players on the scientific and technological world stage. Becomes very, very hard. So a simple precautionary principle is anachronistic at best and at worst won't work. Moreover, what we understand, as I just wrote to you, is that the burdens characteristically will always outweigh the benefits, because what we see is there are always going to be risks that exist as we turn a corner and go over a horizon. We spoke earlier this morning about the idea of strategic shock. Many of these are what we represent as tactical shocks. The fact that somebody will then use this, then change the entire model that we have to use. The longer something is available on a market, the longer the potential for this. I'm not denying for a moment that the driver was beneficent, but certainly there are pullers. Moreover, these things are difficult to apply. I'm up, I'm all done. So, let me hurry up through this. So, how do we get from here to there? Precaution won't work, but preparedness will. It takes a lot of people to do this. That's why you're in the room. Scientists, philosophers. We need prudence. Obviously, policy is equally important. The mechanism, simple. Establish groundwork questions. How are these questions important to understand what ethical systems might work and what ethical systems will not? There are a number of tensions that exist. I've already explained them to you. The pushers we know. The pullers we need to be sensitive about. Because it's these pullers that will in fact dictate the way the science and technology are being used. What I offer you is very, very simple. This is the technology pendulum. What we see is very often technological advancement swings towards positive development, but lagging behind it almost diametrically is the fact that these things then incur negativistic ethical, legal, and social effects. Let's not be naive. I can't stop this. I don't want to stop this. What I call for is something that looks far more like that. A reasonable alignment, so that as we go off to some unforeseen future, at very, very least what we're able to do is prompting the question of what is the best way forward. It throws the issue of responsibility back to the scientists and those who are dealing with it. Not to be able to say we're not going to sign things, we're not going to be participating. No, it's a participatory involvement. It recognizes the potential ways that these technologies can be used, and then also is involved and participatory in the way they should be used. The goal here is not to retard praxis, not at all, not to retard progress. I instead advocate the philosophy of Hannah Arendt. One can either slave away like an animal and then suddenly wake up and go, oh my gosh, what have we done? Or in fact, what they can recognize is they can be creative and ingenious in the way they're working. And see that at each and every point, there is time to discourse and recognize how we're going and what are we doing. We don't have time to get into this, but you know what this is, right? It's not a trick question. It's an egg. How do we move forward? Like that.
Wow.
I'll talk to you about this one after the break. What it basically explains to you is very simple. Science changes. As the epistemological capital changes, what we see is we see a set of duties that are inherent to those who go into the profession. Ultimately, it's going to serve individuals in society. This should be a reflexive ethic, a cosmopolitan ethic. But ultimately, that science and the ethics that deals with that science cannot exist without guidelines and policy, just as the living, breathing part of the egg that will develop into something that takes wing cannot exist without the shell. The shell alone, fragile, brittle, fractures. The stuff in the middle, without the shell, snot, goop. Ultimately, what I'm calling for is an engaged neuroethics, a cosmopolitan neuroethics, that recognizes the potential and potentiality of the way these technologies can be used for benefit, and also for potential burdens and harms. Ultimately, great responsibility comes of this. It's a Faustian responsibility. I won't bore you with the quote because I'm out of time, but it's a wonderful quote. It simply says, as Faust was about to cross over into unlimited knowledge and capability, Mephisto put his hand on his shoulder and said, simply, come, let's go. But what are the dangers you'll know? Remember that blood guilt that you might bring down from your own hand might be on the town. So ladies and gentlemen, what I leave you with, and I apologize for my running a little long, is that this is the ongoing work of neuroethics. that any one of these scientific and technological advances must be predicated and conjoined to an ongoing and equally dedicated system of reflection, pause, and intervention. My father was an engineer. He used to bounce me on his lap when I was a little kid. He used to tell me, Jim, measure twice, cut once. Because far too often, there's no going back. If you want to get in touch with me, that's where. Thank you.
Well, that went for a little longer than we planned. But that's okay. I think we should take some time, take some questions, definitely, and I'll just do like the Chinese and cut short your coffee break instead. So I'm going to open the floor. Anyone who wants to comment or ask questions? Robert?
I don't know where to begin. I thought it was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I really liked that. I thought you did it from a lot of different angles and orchestrated them all. And you were pulling all sorts of strands together. I think the masters were able to weave it into a nice web that came through. I'm sorry, I just have a philosophical idea. You mentioned Foucault and bioethics, or biopower, sorry. And I guess, did you see that? I mean, he viewed that particularly in the relationship of power inequalities within society and in the large global perspective. And one of the things that you kept coming back to is sort of a Western state. Well, if we're not doing it, we've got to say. There's very much a sense of, I guess I was thinking to yourself, I guess I was thinking to ask you to speculate forward and say, as we do see this growing spread, what you speculated seemed to say, well, in essence, the continuation of what's been the 20th century position, which is, well, you have a Western position. It's been the dominant position, by far the dominant position. Fundamentally, what you were suggesting was, well, basically continue that forward because other people are going to get stuff, and we're going to have to be responding to them anyway. I guess, I'm sorry, if I misunderstood.
And I rushed through it, so I apologize. No, actually not. I mean, what I think we're going to see is a shift with regard to the haves and the have-nots. It won't be the same
Some of the
thing.
haves, yeah.
Okay. I also think that the idea of Frank superpower may not necessarily be the same as it was, for example, in the last 20 or 50 years. The possibility of one among many certainly exists, but I think also the idea that agent actors will be able to negotiate great power against nation states through the use of science and technology will be increasingly real. So what we're seeing is shifting architectonics on the world stage. What Rolly Benedicto, my colleague from Stanford, refers to as the new global shift, and I agree with that. I also think you're seeing a rise of particular forms of fundamentalism that leverage as part of the socio-political agenda, for which many of these technologies may be leveraged, and may also be retained, interestingly, for a new form of biopower that says this is how we now control various groups, and we can control them through ways that are both explicit and implicit. So I don't necessarily see the frank domination of those older Western ideals. In fact, what I really see is at least the potential for tension, if not conflict, occurring because of the increasing rise of those non-Western agents, actors, and state nation actors that are then capable of leveraging economics as well as frank scientific and technological power structures on the world stage. So that's going to shift. So, other questions?
We have room for one or two questions. Yeah, yes.
I've got two if I can be greedy. One was a very good presentation, as Robert said. You try to decouple complexity, certainly in the human brain, and that's very difficult. And the only question I'd ask you is that as the brain evolves, both through age and obviously experiences and learning, can we really map it as to what we're doing with these techniques, etc.? As I think Colin actually sort of mentioned that we're plasticity, we're not machines, we're not made of the same DNA to the exact same specification, etc. So can we really use these techniques to do that?
Yeah,
So that was my question on complexity, if anything, and perhaps related to it is then trying to do the opposite. Is when you mentioned about deprogramming people. Physically, we do it. Yeah, you're close to retirement. You need to do these courses, and therefore start to get yourself ready for that retirement stage. But you're trying to do it on the cognition stage now as well. So, two thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll address them very quickly because I don't want to infringe anyone else's time. It's a great question for the break. It's a great question over a single malt, by the way. The first question is, I think it becomes very, very difficult for longitudinal mapping of the brain without a sufficiently large database. One of the things that we recognize that there's a very strong neurocyber fusion with regard to the interaction. To enable these particular neurotechnologies to be as efficient as they could be, part of the deficit with regard to the clinical translation is they require a huge database for point-to-point mapping. So if I in fact wanted to determine how to map you, I would need a fairly longitudinal plot to do that, and then be able to have temporal comparisons, both with regard to your lifespan data, to match you against your baseline, and then also some type of comparative, if not normative data against cohorts like you, and perhaps a generalized population. That's a huge computational undertaking. It's not impossible. However, it too then raises neurosecurity issues. Because although the actual components of that may be relatively secure, the stacking points are hackable. So the old adage, if it's stackable, it's hackable, becomes very, very impressive. And then you have a different level of neurosecurity, being able to change neurorelevant data, literally from genome all the way to sociome. And as a consequence, even subtle manipulations there are ampliative. So there's some real issues in doing that. Not to say it can't be done, but they're cautious issues. And the second one is regard to the whole issue of enablement and post-enablement. Our sociology tells us we don't de-enable people very well, particularly if those enablements were physiological enablements. So those individuals who were physically enabled, one could take a look, for example, at professional athletics or even collegiate athletics, putting those individuals into a scenario where they're not then able to exercise those physical acumen and traits becomes very, very difficult, and that can be problematic. If we're now working on this level, a lot of forethought needs to go into how we're going to then enable individuals and then have some longitudinality with regard to actually either disenabling them, shutting something off, or then providing a viable social milieu in which at least those traits are then compensable. So it becomes difficult. So, thank you.
One more, if anyone else? Yes,
I have really enjoyed this talk, but I was also thinking about when putting together this agenda, there are interesting problems of not just how to get different kinds of people to work together with each other across discipline boundaries, but also set up the rewards and incentive structure so it becomes a truth-seeking endeavor and not just more. My standard example is that as a bioethicist, I love talking about cognition enhancement and how important that's going to be for the future. The more people believe cognition enhancement is really important, the more job I get and the more nice workshops I get invited to. Now, I might be right that it is very important. However, there is a certain biasing factor here. In some institutions and in some domains, we have ways of controlling for these inherent biases. We have learned to ignore that all scientific papers end with more research is needed. Yeah, of course it should be there, just like an acknowledgement, but we will kind of ignore that factor when we can battle. So in your program, what would you suggest to get the incentive structure right so it becomes more truth-seeking?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. Part of the reason is I think that there's a real incentive to do that with regard to the individuals who are actually participatory in the community, but it's very, very difficult to administer. So there's this whole new movement towards scientific convergence, inclusive of not only within the physical and natural sciences, but the social sciences as well, and increasingly the humanities. One of the programs that we advocate is one called InStep, which is Integrated Science, Technology, Ethics, and Policy. It's very, very difficult within university infrastructures to be able to de-silo some of those disciplinary fields and to be able to actually create metrics that then say, yes, you're doing your job well, and so is she, and how do we then meter the collaborative efforts in terms of outcomes and products. So the incentivization, I think, is there from the part of the participants. Now the real task falls upon administrative infrastructures to be able to create those opportunistic fields to allow those things to thrive. I don't know if the large university is going to be capable of doing it, but I see increasingly that university offshoot programs, smaller centers that may not necessarily work under the same constraints that the large university administration works under might be the way to go. And certainly the thing that I advocate is not that scientists and ethicists and technologists remain in their silos, or even, for example, sign off various petitions, say we're not going to do X, Y, and Z. That's not participatory. I think the idea of engaged participation is going to be important, but support is really hard to relate. So, thank you.
Okay.